The morning in your backyard looks almost the same as it always has. The soft light settling over the fence line, the faint sound of leaves shifting in a slow, warm breeze, and somewhere near the feeder, a northern cardinal sits still on a low branch as if it has been there longer than you have been awake. A black-capped chickadee moves in and out of the shadows, quick and precise, touching the edge of the feeder for only a moment before pulling back into the safety of a nearby perch. Everything appears normal at first glance, almost comfortingly familiar. But if you stay still long enough, you begin to notice something harder to explain. A small hesitation where there used to be none. A pause in the air before movement resumes. A distance that feels slightly wider than it should be. The birds are still here, but the way they hold space has changed. It is subtle enough that most people would never name it, yet present enough that you feel it before you understand it. A mourning dove shifts along the fence line, stops, turns, then waits an extra second before stepping forward, as if recalibrating something invisible in the environment. And for a moment, the entire yard feels like it is listening to something you cannot hear. If you are new here, you might want to take a moment and subscribe before you continue, because what you are about to see changes the way you look at every small movement outside your window, and it is not something you will easily forget. And maybe that is the part that feels strange, because nothing has disappeared, nothing has changed in an obvious way, and yet everything feels slightly further away than it used to be. And that is where the quiet question begins to form, not in what you see, but in what no longer comes quite as close as it once did. And as you stand there a little longer, something in your mind quietly resists the idea that anything is actually wrong, because everything still looks correct in the way mornings are supposed to look, the same fence line catching the same light, the same feeder hanging still in the air, the same small movements of wings that you have seen 1,000 times before. And yet, there is a feeling that does not fully match what your eyes are telling you. A soft dissonance that you cannot quite explain, like remembering a conversation where the words were familiar but the meaning was slightly different. You have probably felt this before without naming it, the sense that nature around you is never fully random, that certain mornings feel heavier, quieter, or more aware of you than others, even when nothing visually has changed. A northern cardinal shifts again on its branch, not leaving, not approaching, just holding position in a way that feels more observant than it used to. A black-capped chickadee darts in, pauses longer than expected, then retreats as if reconsidering the space it just entered. And somewhere in that rhythm, you start to recognize something deeply human in your own response. Because most people do not notice the exact moment when attention in a space begins to change, they only notice when distance has already formed. It is a strange thing, because you do not remember asking for this awareness. And yet once it arrives, it is difficult to ignore. If you are feeling that same quiet curiosity right now, the kind that makes you look twice at the simplest things outside your window, you are not alone in it, and you are exactly the kind of presence this space seems to respond to. And what most people never realize is that this subtle feeling of being observed by nature is often the first thing that shifts long before anything else becomes visible, long before behavior changes enough to be named. But that is only the surface of it, because underneath this shared experience there is something more consistent happening in patterns that most people walk past every single day without ever noticing they are part of it. And if you keep watching long enough, something else begins to emerge beneath the surface of the morning, not as a sudden change, but as a gradual realization that the birds in your yard are not simply moving through space randomly, but are interacting with it in a way that feels almost structured, almost as if the space itself has invisible boundaries they are constantly testing. A northern cardinal no longer simply lands where it used to. It now pauses just slightly farther back before committing to the feeder, as if measuring something unseen in the air between you and it. A black-capped chickadee does not rush in with the same ease as before. Instead it arrives, stops, repositions on a nearby branch, and only then approaches, as though recalculating a decision it once made instantly. These are not dramatic changes, and that is exactly what makes them difficult to notice, because nothing is missing, nothing is gone. Yet the rhythm has subtly reorganized itself around something you cannot directly point to. Most people walk through moments like this every day without realizing that what they are witnessing is not randomness, but pattern recognition happening on a level outside of conscious awareness, where behavior becomes a language of hesitation, spacing, and return. And if you start to think about it more carefully, you may begin to notice that certain birds are not avoiding you. They are simply adjusting how close they allow the world to feel. It is almost as if the yard itself has developed invisible layers of familiarity, where some areas feel safe enough to enter without thought, while others require a brief pause, a check, a decision that happens in silence. And what is most striking is that this shift does not feel like something imposed from outside, but something discovered from within the behavior itself, as though the birds are revealing a structure that was always there but never spoken. But that realization is still only the beginning, because once you recognize that their movements are not random at all, the next question naturally forms in the quiet space they leave behind, and it is a question most people never think to ask directly. And at some point in that quiet observation, the mind naturally searches for explanation, because when patterns become too consistent to ignore, you begin to wonder whether something is actually shaping them beneath the surface. Researchers in urban ornithology have noted something subtle but important about backyard birds like the northern cardinal and the black-capped chickadee, that their behavior is not just reactive, but predictive in small, measurable ways, built on repetition, timing, and environmental memory. In long-term field observations from places like Cornell Lab of Ornithology, birds have been shown to develop what scientists call anticipatory movement patterns, meaning they begin arriving at feeding sites not just in response to food, but in response to learned environmental cues tied to safety and predictability. A feeder is not just a source of food, it becomes part of a spatial map that a bird mentally updates every day, where distance, timing, and even human presence are encoded into whether or not it feels safe to approach. A black-capped chickadee, for example, weighing only about 0.4 ounces, operates on extremely tight energy margins in colder months, which means every unnecessary risk carries real survival cost, and so its decisions are shaped less by curiosity and more by pattern recognition of safety over time. Even a slight change in movement consistency, such as a human appearing at irregular intervals, or approaching too quickly, can shift its threshold for how close it is willing to come. And what feels like emotional distance from our perspective is, in their world, a recalibration of risk, a quiet adjustment of trust built on repetition rather than intention. Nothing about this is mystical in isolation. Yet when you step back and watch it unfold across days, it begins to feel like something more layered, because science describes the mechanism, but experience describes the feeling of being included or excluded from that invisible map. And once that idea settles in, the question is no longer whether the birds are reacting to you, but how long it takes for a place, and the way you move within it, to become part of what they consider safe. And over time, something subtle begins to shift not only in the birds, but in the way you begin to notice them, as if your attention itself is learning their rhythm. A northern cardinal no longer feels like just a flash of red at the edge of the yard, but a presence that arrives with a certain kind of timing, pausing on the same fence post, facing the same direction, holding still long enough that you start to recognize it before you consciously register it. A black-capped chickadee darts in and out of the feeder, but now you catch the small pause before it commits, the way it tilts slightly toward the open space as if checking whether the air itself feels right. These moments are small, almost invisible on their own, yet they begin to stack inside your awareness like quiet repetitions of something you were not originally paying attention to. And without realizing it, you find yourself waiting a little longer near the window, not because you expect anything specific to happen, but because the space outside no longer feels entirely separate from you. It feels shared in a way that is difficult to explain. The wind moves through the branches, the feeder swings slightly after a landing, and even the sound of wings cutting through the air begins to feel like part of a pattern you are slowly learning to recognize by instinct rather than thought. If you have ever stood still in a morning like this, you know that it does not feel like observation anymore. After a while, it feels like participation, as if your presence is quietly included in the same system the birds are responding to. And that is when something even more subtle begins to form, not in their behavior alone, but in the space between your attention and theirs, where repetition turns into familiarity, and familiarity begins to feel like a kind of unspoken connection that neither side is actively naming, but both are slowly beginning to acknowledge in the quiet way they share the same air. And then there are mornings when the feeling is no longer just about subtle distance or quiet familiarity, but something deeper that begins to feel almost structured, as if the entire yard is holding a rhythm you are only partially aware of. You notice it first in the way the northern cardinal no longer arrives alone, but seems to follow a timing that aligns with other small movements in the space, like the black-capped chickadee appearing just moments after a shift in light, or the mourning dove settling on the fence line at the exact pause between two bursts of wind. Nothing about it is loud or dramatic, but together it begins to feel like coordination, not in the sense of intention, but in the sense of something consistent being quietly maintained. Even the silence between calls feels different now, stretched slightly longer than before, as if the space itself is allowing room for something unseen to settle before the next movement begins. You might stand there and realize that the yard does not feel empty even when no bird is visible, because the absence itself carries a kind of expectation, a sense that something will return to complete the pattern. And in those moments, the idea of separation between observer and observed starts to blur. Because you are no longer simply watching random visits. You are watching a system that responds in real time to presence, timing, and stillness. The air feels less like background and more like medium, something the birds move through with awareness that seems to extend beyond individual action. And without fully realizing when it happened, you begin to anticipate their behavior in return, not because you are predicting them, but because you are slowly becoming part of the same rhythm they have already been responding to. But just as that realization starts to settle, there is one detail that does not quite fit into any simple explanation, a small inconsistency in timing that appears only when you stop trying to control the observation and simply allow it to unfold. And that is where the pattern begins to reveal something even more unexpected than before. And somewhere along the way, the feeling in the yard begins to shift again, not away from the pattern you have been noticing, but deeper into it, as if what once felt like small behavioral adjustments has started to form something more continuous, something that holds even when you are not actively watching. A northern cardinal appears on the fence post at nearly the same moment the morning light touches the edge of the feeder, not earlier, not later, and a black-capped chickadee follows soon after, moving through the branches in a sequence that feels less like isolated decisions and more like responses to something you cannot see directly. Many people who spend enough time observing wild birds begin to describe moments like this not as coincidence, but as alignment, not in a mystical sense, but in the sense that living systems often develop rhythms that are shaped by repetition, memory, and shared environmental cues. Something about this feels difficult to ignore, because even when you remind yourself that each movement has a practical explanation, the overall structure begins to feel larger than the sum of its parts, as if the yard is participating in a quiet exchange that extends beyond what is immediately visible. In some observations recorded by bird behavior researchers, birds like the mourning dove and northern cardinal are known to adjust their approach patterns based on perceived consistency in their environment, which includes not just predators or food sources, but also the predictability of movement around them. And when you stand still long enough to notice it, you may begin to feel that your own presence is part of that predictability, not as a cause or a trigger, but as a stabilizing point within a larger rhythm. Many people believe that nature does not communicate in direct messages, yet there is something in these repeated, almost synchronized patterns that makes that assumption feel less complete than it once did. It does not demand belief, and it does not offer certainty, but it leaves behind a question that lingers quietly in the space between observation and feeling, where meaning begins to form without ever fully declaring itself. And as you continue to watch, that question does not disappear. It only deepens, especially in the moments when the yard falls into a stillness that feels too precise to be accidental. And then there are moments when everything feels like it finally slows down, not because anything has changed again, but because your attention has settled into the rhythm so completely that there is nothing left to chase, only something left to notice. The yard looks the same as it did before, the fence still holding the line of the horizon, the feeder still hanging in its quiet place, but the movement that once felt like separate events now feels like part of a single continuous breath. A northern cardinal sits still longer than usual, not moving away, not approaching, simply existing in the same space with a kind of calm that feels almost deliberate, while a black-capped chickadee lands briefly, pauses, and then disappears into the branches without urgency. There is no climax here, no sudden shift, only a deepening stillness that makes even the smallest motion feel meaningful in a way it did not before. And in that stillness, something inside you also begins to quiet, as if the need to interpret everything is slowly giving way to something more observational, more receptive. Many people who spend time in moments like this describe it not as understanding something new, but as remembering something they did not realize they had forgotten. the feeling that nature does not always need to be decoded, because sometimes it only needs to be witnessed. The wind moves gently through the branches, the light softens across the yard, and even the silence between bird calls feels complete, not empty. And without trying to hold on to any conclusion, you simply remain there for a moment longer, aware that nothing is asking for explanation anymore, only presence, and in that presence there is a kind of quiet resolution that does not need to be spoken to be felt. And in the final quiet moments, there is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to measure, only the simple presence of a morning that feels unchanged on the surface, yet carries the memory of everything you have just noticed. The northern cardinal still returns to its familiar place on the fence line. The black-capped chickadee still moves between branch and feeder in its quick, delicate rhythm, and the mourning dove still settles into the distance as if it has always belonged there. But now, nothing feels accidental in the way it once did. Every small movement seems to exist within a larger continuity that you cannot fully see, yet you can no longer ignore. And what remains with you is not an answer, but a quiet awareness that the space you call your backyard has been speaking in a language of timing, distance, and return long before you ever began to notice it. Many people would still call it coincidence. Many others would call it behavior, but for you, it has become something harder to place into a single definition because it lives somewhere between observation and feeling, between science and something that feels almost like recognition. And as the light shifts slightly across the yard one last time, the birds do not announce anything. They do not explain anything. They simply continue as they always have, as if nothing at all has changed except the way you are now seeing them. Thank you for staying until the end and sharing this time together in stillness and attention. If you find meaning in these quiet stories of nature and presence, you are always welcome here, and you might consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still countless moments outside our windows that most people walk past without ever truly noticing. And perhaps the next one is already waiting for you just beyond the glass. And as the yard settles into its familiar silence again, there is a lingering sense that what you have witnessed does not end here. It simply continues in a different form, somewhere just beyond what you can easily explain, and maybe it was only birds moving through a morning yard, but it never felt like only that. And somewhere out there tonight, the same quiet rhythm will return without ever needing to announce itself.